Chapter 35, The Thief of Virtue. They gazed at Durer's four virtues. Marvin felt again the thrill that had coursed through him when he first saw them in Denny's study. Carl squinted at the miniature images. "Are you sure they're the real ones?" he asked Christina. "The ones that were stolen?" Christina nodded, unable to speak. Her eyes moved from one figure to the next, stopping at the picture of Justice. "Look at it," she said. "I thought I'd never see it again." She walked along the edge of the table, holding her breath. "And Prudence and Temperance, they've been missing for more than 2 years." Together at last, the drawings had a pulsing energy that filled the room like music rising. Of course they were real, Marvin thought. There was no mistaking them. Christina turned to James. "How on earth? I don't understand. How you find them? How did you find them?" James bit his lip. "Where did you get his briefcase, James?" Carl asked quietly. "Where did you get this?" James shifted from one foot to the other, his gray eyes anxious. It was in an apartment, he said finally. He took the crinkled label out of his jeans pocket and set it on the table. Christina picked it up, her brow furrowing. "This is Gordon Perry's place." James hesitated. "I think he's the one who took the drawings." "Now, hold on. Who's Gordon Perry?" Carl asked. "One of our curators," Christina said. "But what do you mean, James? Gordon's in Florence, helping with restoration work at the Uffizi. He's been there for a month. Denny's staying at his place." James chewed his bottom lip, watching her. "Where is Denny?" Carl asked impatiently. "We have to tell him what's happened." "Yes, of course. I'll call him now." Christina lifted the phone on her desk. "He already knows," James said. Both Christina and Carl turned to James, staring at him so intently now that Marvin felt obliged to duck back under James's collar lest he be seen. "What are you talking about?" Carl asked. James swallowed and stared at the floor. But Christina crouched in front of him, her voice coaxing James. "What is it?" "I told Denny already. I called here and told him about Fortitude, and he said he'd go get you." James stopped, but he didn't. Christina put her hands on his shoulders and looked straight into his eyes. Marvin cringed at the bewildered sincerity in her face. How could he ever have doubted her? He felt a wave of guilt. He deserved an honest answer, but what would James say? It was all too hard to explain. "James, you have to tell us what's going on," Christina continued. "How did you find these drawings? Why do you have this briefcase?" "Listen," James began, and Marvin knew he was assembling the details in his mind, his imagination rushing to fill each pause. "When he came this morning and Christina showed us my drawing, I found that address, right here rolled up on the floor." James pointed vaguely under the table. "I had this weird feeling, I can't explain it. I figured the address had something to do with the drawing. I thought maybe it had fallen off the paper, you know, the package that was supposed to have the real Fortitude inside." James glanced at them desperately. Even Marvin felt confused at this point, and he could tell from their faces that Carl and Christina were thoroughly baffled. The story was sounding more implausible the longer James talked. "Anyway," James continued lamely, looking at the floor. "It was like a mailing label. It seemed important, but I figured you wouldn't believe me if I told you, Dad, so that's why I left without saying anything." He took a deep breath and plunged into the rest of the tale. "And then I found Fortitude in the apartment. I tried to call you, Dad, but your cell phone wasn't working. So I had to call here, and Denny answered the phone. It was, I don't know, about an hour ago. I said where I was, and I told Denny about the drawing, and he said he'd tell you, and you'd all come right away." James stopped, raising his eyes slowly to their faces. "But he didn't tell you, did he?" "I think he didn't tell you because he stole the drawings. They were in that Gordon Perry's guy's apartment, in Denny's briefcase." "James," Carl said. His voice was sterner than Marvin had ever heard it. "That's a terrible accusation to make." "I know, Dad, but..." Carl shook his head. "Denny's been my friend for years. I'm sure there's an explanation." James stared miserably at the briefcase. Look, it has the sign of the Getty Museum on it, and Denny's initials," he mumbled, gesturing. Christina was still kneeling next to him, but her gaze shifted back to the briefcase, then to the drawing. She was silent for a long time. Denny helped with the entire theft, she said finally. He knew every detail of the arrangements we'd made. The timing where the microchip would be hidden, the name of the undercover FBI agent. Carl stared at her. So you knew those things too. Christina shook her head slightly, as if she was trying to puzzle out something. It's Denny we're talking about, Carl protested. Yes, Christina said. She stood. He was with me the night I switched to drawings. We were the only two in the museum at that hour, besides the security staff. Right, Carl said, but that doesn't make him a thief. When we made the exchange, I brought the real juror here to my office. Denny was with me. I wrapped it up, and I don't know how can it be? It's Denny. He couldn't have done this. No, he's not a thief, but listen to me, Christina said pensively. He was with me, but we were also, apart at different times. He could have changed the wrapping. He was the one who hung James's drawing down in the gallery while I took the real juror, or what I thought was the real juror, up to the 5th floor to the vault in the director's office. Christina, Carl interrupted. I know. It's so hard to believe. She lapsed into silence again, staring at the drawings. Carl, today when I told him Fortitude was gone, there was something wrong with the way he reacted. He was upset, certainly, but he seemed almost more concerned about me, and I kept thinking, this is so strange. One of Getty's prized artworks may be lost forever, and he's telling me how sorry he is. Well, of course he was sorry, Carl exclaimed. He loves Durer's work, and he knows you do too. Yes, Christina said. She sighed. This is his briefcase. I'm sure of it. Look, DEM and the Getty logo. She lifted her phone. I think we need to talk to Denny himself. James watched her anxiously, and Marvin poked his head farther out, wanting to hear what Denny would possibly say. Christina pursed her lips. He's not picking up his cell. After a minute, she said, Denny, hi, it's Christina. Please call me as soon as you get this message. It's important. She turned to Carl. Let's try the apartment, she said, dialing again. Carl and James stood tensely waiting. After a minute, she shook her head. He's not answering there either. Christina set down the phone, her eyes settling to Fortitude. I was so busy all day yesterday talking to the FBI, going over everything. I wasn't even in the museum for most of it. Of course, I didn't think I needed to double-check the drawing. We'd been so careful in my office, and I trusted him completely. I even asked him a couple times to make sure everything looked all right, and he said it did. Carl shook his head. I don't believe it. Denny, he's a good man. He's as devoted to Durer as you are. Christina nodded. More so. Then why? Why gamble his entire career, not to mention a prison sentence? Will he go to jail? James interrupted, his eyes wide. Maybe he deserves to go to jail, Marvin thought. But Carl didn't answer, still focused on Christina as a practical matter where he would even get the money to buy one of these. Christina hesitated. Well, Denny comes from money, and who knows? Maybe he's the front man for someone else. Marvin thought back to the apartment, to Denny's conversation with the woman with the funny-sounding name. Something about being picked up at an airport. On the black market, Christina continued, the drawings would cost considerably less than their real value. Durer is not nearly as well known as the bigger names of the Renaissance, and these can't be resold anywhere legitimate. Carl paced the room while James watched them both with huge eyes. But it just doesn't make sense. Fortitude was at the Getty already. Why not steal it from there? Why wait till it was all the way across the country? That's the part that does make sense, Christina said slowly. He was much less likely to get caught here. The drawing was on loan to the Met. We were the ones responsible. Oh, my God. She covered her mouth. Justice. Denny was here in New York when it was stolen. He was at a conference. He came to the Met all the time that week. He had full access to the departments. I made sure of it. She shook her head. I couldn't have made this easier for him if I tried. You think he stole all the drawings? Carl asked, stunned. I don't know, Christina said soberly. Maybe he hired people to take the first two. She rested her hand weakly next to Fortitude. With this one, I might as well have presented it to him gift-wrapped. James looked from one to the other, and Marvin could see that his pale face was pinched and tired. It had been a long day, but you said he couldn't sell them, right? He asked, and he couldn't show them to anybody or tell anybody he had them because the police would be looking for them. So why did he do this? Christina's eyes traced the 4 tiny images. Maybe he just wanted them together for himself. Marvin remembered Denny in the dark study, looking at the drawings with tears in his eyes. So what now? Carl asked Christina. Are you going to call the FBI? If this is true, Christina winced. Can you imagine tomorrow's headlines? It'll be awful for him and for the 2 museums, for everyone. But will he go to jail? James asked again. Carl and Christina were silent. After a minute, Carl said, Look at the expression on Justice's face, he said. This is why she looks so sad. James glanced up at his father, and Carl explained. Because the right thing to do can be so awful sometimes. There seemed nothing more to say. Marvin crouched beneath James's collar, his heart heavy. Carl ran his finger through his hair. We should call the FBI. Tell them about the drawings. He looked at James. I still don't understand how you found these, James. How'd you even get into the apartment by yourself? How did you know they'd be there? James squirmed awkwardly, avoiding his father's eyes. It's like I said, I found the address and I just knew, he answered softly. And then when I got there, I used a paperclip to... What? Carl's mouth dropped open. You picked the lock? Sort of, James said quickly. He turned to Christina, and Marvin knew he was trying to change the subject. Why can't you just give the drawings back? That's the important thing anyway. Why do you have to tell the police about Denny? Christina touched his hair gently. It's a crime, James. Think of jurors' virtues, prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice. Above all, justice. Don't you think we have a duty to honor those ideals? James looked worried at Carl. But those aren't the only good things. What about sticking up for somebody? Isn't that important too? Denny's your friend, but he did a bad thing. Marvin wanted to protest. He couldn't forget the surge of anger he'd felt listening to Denny's side of the phone conversation when Christina told him the real drawing had been stolen. Denny had lied to her. He'd manipulated all of them. But then Marvin remembered that James didn't know that. James thought of him only as a kindly, rumpled man who loved jurors' drawings. Christina turned to Carl. The Greeks said the 4 virtues contained all the rest, remember? Carl shook his head. But they don't. Denny's a good friend. I can't believe he did this. But if it happened, what about compassion? What about forgiveness? Marvin inched forward again to look at the 4 miniatures. In their crisp, certain strokes, none of these drawings seemed to capture forgiveness. The images had to do with strength and self-control. The girl fighting the lion, the girl measuring wine, the girl refusing the winged suitor, the girl wielding the sword. Forgiveness was softer and more generous. It was something you offered to another person rather than something you demanded of yourself. Christina looked at him for a moment, then said gently, It's a crime, and it's not up to us. She picked up the phone. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's an explanation we haven't thought of, but we have to tell the FBI and let them take it from here. As she dialed, she whispered, Isn't it amazing to see the virtues together like this, just as Durer intended? Marvin studied each drawing, resplendent in its detail. So much human fuss over something so small. It was somehow heartening to him. Carl pulled James close to him, squeezing his shoulder. The FBI will want to talk to you, buddy, but for now, let's go home. Picking locks, finding stolen masterpieces, I'd say your work here is done. Home, Marvin thought. He was immediately overcome with longing for Mama and Papa, for his cotton ball bed and his smothering over-involved relatives. Even for Elaine, he couldn't wait to be back where he belonged.